All good.
Okay.
All right. It's official. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amber, and I'm excited to be hosting today's event in the Shadows of History on behalf of Adventures by the Book. We have a fun afternoon planned for you with 4 fabulous best-selling authors who will be moderating the discussion themselves. I will introduce each of the authors first and open with an introductory question, and then they will take it from there. As always, we make sure to save time at the end for Q&A, so be sure to be thinking of questions that you want to ask the authors, and be sure to post them in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. There's a separate chat box, but we want to post all our questions in the Q&A. It's just easier to get to them, so thank you for that. And also, please be sure to set your chat box to all panelists and attendees and not just panelists, so that way everyone can see your comments and questions. And thank you so much to all of our adventurers for purchasing books to support our authors. Keep in mind that you can still purchase books at adventuresbythebook.com. And without further ado, we're going to jump right in and introduce our authors. So starting off, I am pleased to introduce David R. Gillham, the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of City of Women and also Annalise, a novel of Anne Frank. He studied screenwriting at the University of Southern California before transitioning into fiction. After moving to New York City, David spent more than a decade in the book business, and he now lives with his family in Western Massachusetts. In his new historical novel, Shadows of Berlin, it is 1955 in New York City, a city engorged with skyscrapers, blaring traffic, instant coffee, roaring subways, and ultra-modern TVs, and a city that daily reinvents itself to meet a perpetually unfolding future. Very interesting. I'm so excited to read that one coming up. Next, we have best-selling author Audrey Blake. She claims to have a split personality because she is the creative alter ego of writing duo Jema Fixon and Regina Sarois. And actually, Regina is here today, so everyone say hi to Regina. These two authors who met as finalists of a writing contest and have been writing together happily ever since. They share a love of history, nature, literature, and stories of redoubtable women.
And Jema's here too.
Yes. Both are here. And both are prairie girls. Jema hails from Alberta, Canada, and Regina calls the wheat fields of Kansas home. In Audrey's book, The Surgeon's Daughter, Nora is the only female student at a prestigious medical school in Bologna, a rarity. In the 19th century, women are expected to remain at home and raise children, so her unconventional, indelicate ambitions to become a licensed surgeon offend the men around her. Very interesting. I'm excited to hear more about that. Thank you, too. Next up, we have Bryan Thomas, the author of the heartbreaking, thought-provoking, and uplifting historical novel For Those Who Are Lost. She is married to mystery novelist Will Thomas. Inspired by true events, For Those Who Are Lost begins on the eve of the Nazi invasion of the island of Guernsey. I hope I said that right. I'm sorry if I didn't. Guernsey, thank you. When terrified parents have a choice to make, send their children alone to England or keep the family together and risk whatever may come to their villages. That sounds so suspenseful, and I'm excited to hear more. And last but not least, we have our internationally best-selling author, Tracey Enerson Wood, who has always had the writing bug. While working as a registered nurse, starting her own interior design company, raising 2 children, and bouncing around the world as a military wife, she indulged in her passion as a playwright, screenwriter, and novelist. Wow, Tracey, you sound so busy. Thank you for, writing during that time. She has authored magazine columns and other nonfiction, and written and directed many plays. Based on a true story, her most recent novel, The War Nurse, is a sweeping historical novel that takes readers on an unforgettable journey through World War I France. Very cool, very exciting. So welcome David, Audrey, Julia, and Tracey, and Regina. To get the discussion going, I'd like to start by asking each of you to go back in time in the shadows of your own history and talk a little bit about your first exposure to books and writing and how that propelled you to become the renowned writers you are today. And anyone can start.
Well, when I was about to, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think David wants to start, and I was right.
When I was about, 7 or 8 years old, we were playing school, myself and my next door neighbor. and her little sister, Karen. And Karen was the teacher, and she gave us an assignment to write something. So that day I wrote, "The Day I Turned into a Rock." And in the story, which was about a page long, I turn into a rock, and I have all these adventures that rocks obviously have all the time, and ended up being built into a wonderful house at the end. It's a happy ending, of course. And that was the first time that I noticed that I really liked writing something. And I sort of continued to do it after that forever. I would write plays in the backyard for the kids in the backyard to perform. And then as an adult in undergrad, I still was writing, even though that I was studying political science. And then I went to USC for screenwriting. And there I actually switched from screenwriting to fiction. And I've been doing that ever since.
Good. I guess I'll go next. I remember the first time realizing that I liked writing. I was in second grade, and I went to a Catholic school, and the nuns made everybody write. That's, we did it a lot. I mean, one good thing, I guess, about a good Catholic education is we wrote, and we wrote and we wrote until I actually had a big bump on my writing fingers. It's still a little bit there. Of course, this is all longhand. And we would just write stories. We're just encouraged to, just use our imagination, and maybe there'd be a prompt, maybe not. And I just sort of, just did it. I didn't know that there was any other way. So fast forward to my professional life. And as Amber mentioned, I was a registered nurse. And I remember working on the floors of a hospital in a med-surg unit. And one of the things that all nurses hate to do, it's like the bane of their existence, is charting after a very long, tiring shift, when all you really want to do is go home and you don't want to think about anything. You just, you want to write it quick and with as few letters as possible. And it's one of the reasons why nurses and doctors' handwriting is so terrible. But anyway, I found that the charting part of the day was my favorite part of the day. And I actually sort of enjoyed looking back on the things that I'd done that day, and kind of seeing maybe some good I did or didn't do good, or thinking about a child maybe that got miraculously better, and then just writing a few words about it and trying to see how I could put it in just the right words, not too many words, just the right words. And so I sort of realized when I was trying to figure out how could I better say that I took a patient to the X-ray department, that maybe I should be writing, maybe there's something to that, because it was just natural. It's something I just did. And then quite recently, I'm working on my third novel, and I had a deadline, of course, and working very hard on it. I have a word deadline where my butt is in chair for that many words, no matter how long it takes. So I had gone through about 3 or 4 months of butt and chair time, and was really looking forward to sending this project out to my beta readers and agent, and then taking a break and just not thinking about it and not writing, and just letting my mind just wander and pay attention to a husband I hadn't seen in 4 months and all these things. But you know what I did? I wrote a short story. I started another novel. I wrote my will. I mean, it's just there. And like David, it's like, if I'm not thinking about writing, I'm writing plays or something like that. And it's, it's just what we do.
Thank you so much, Tracey. Jema, do you want to add in?
Sure. I think my love affair with words started quite young, like David. My mother gave me Pierre Berton's The Secret World of Og. He's a well-regarded Canadian writer, and wrote this story about his own children. There's 5 or 6 of them, and they all have names that start with the letter P, and they go down this secret tunnel below their playhouse to this underground land that's peopled by creatures that have green skin, and anyways, my mom gave it to me and she didn't know that I could read yet. And so she was surprised because I just stayed in my book and I read the whole thing until I was done. And it was a longer chapter book. And so she didn't believe that I had read it. So she started quizzing me and I had, and I just loved stories. And so I was a voracious reader and always have been. And I think it's easy to, when your favorite author you've read everything that they've read and you want to read some more like that, sometimes the only solution is to write something like it yourself. So
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
that's how I got into it. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. Regina, what about you?
I'm just still impressed that David's first work was so Kafka-esque. The day I turned into a rock at age 7. I'm pretty impressed with this,
Yeah, he was a big
actually.
influence on me when I was 7.
And it doesn't surprise me that Jane was reading books before anyone knew she could read. Like every time I turn around, she's like, I read 8 more books yesterday. Like I don't even know how her brain does it. But for me, I think we started to understand that my brain was kind of helplessly one-sided at 2nd grade when we were learning how to do word problems in math. It was a math class when I started to understand that this was going to be a problem because they were teaching word problems. I can't remember the word problem, but I remember the situation of reading the word problem, and the teacher came around and she tapped my book and she said, Regina, you need to write down the problem. And I looked up at her in complete confusion. And she walked down the row and she came back, tapped the book, write down the numbers. And I just burst into tears. And she said, oh no, what's wrong? And I said, what problem? It's a story. All I could see were the flowers and the apples, and that I had no idea that I was lost in the story. I just thought it was really nice that Miguel gave away flowers. Like that was very sweet to me. And I was completely there. So I had no idea that there was any math to this class at all. And then the next year, I discovered War of the World in 3rd grade, sitting on my parents' shelf. And I guess I was bored that day, so I took it down and I read H.G. Wells' War of the World in 3rd grade. And my father asked me about it like when I finished it a week later. And he said, what did you think of the Martians? And I started laughing. I was like, what Martians? And he said, what book did you read? And I was like, Dad, I read the book about the Martians. Like, so I think my love of books and reading was always a little more ahead of my abilities sometimes. And I wanted the big stories and the deep stories before I had any way of reading the vocabulary. So
thank you so much. And Julia?
I loved books and writing from a very early age. I lived with my grandparents when I was very young, and my grandmother was such an Anglophile. She read books all the time. She gave me books all the time. And she would read, while she was reading Du Maurier, she was having me read Ring of Bright Water and all kinds of interesting things that were probably way too old for me, but I just fell in love with that time period. And later, by 3rd grade, I was falling in love with books that I discovered, like The Railway Children. So all of my love of books has always been kind of centered in England for my whole life. It's just, I don't know if it's just her influence or just what appealed to me personally. But when I was a little bit older and she moved away, she started writing me letters. And she said, you know what we are? We're writers. And she would write poems or little snippets of stories. And I have letters in the attic dating back to 7 years old when I was writing her and saying, this is the poem I wrote for you today. This is the story I wrote for you. And we shared that all the way through my entire childhood. So it was really fun finding those letters. Many years later, I hadn't remembered hardly any of that. And just seeing what a great influence she was on my life and how much she loved writing. And I know she would be so excited to know that I've gone into writing as a career. So that's exciting.
Oh, Julia, that's so touching. Thank you for sharing that with us. Now I understand that each of you have a couple questions that you'd like to ask each other. So we're going to go ahead and dive into that. And David, would you like to start us off?
Sure. My
you.
question is, why history? What about history has drawn everybody into the world of fiction? I can answer that myself first if you want me to start off. History's always been something for me that I just loved. I came from a family of painters, and I assumed I was going to be an artist, but I was going to be a historical illustrator. And I was a huge Civil War buff when I was a kid. And so I would, draw pictures and do paintings, but I would also write stories. And eventually, so the writing sort of eclipsed the painting, but I couldn't get away from the history. And it just seemed like the place I was most comfortable, for lack of a better way of explaining it.
I have to agree with you. 6 years ago, I published my first novel, and it was a contemporary mystery. And it was a Library Journal debut of the month. I was really excited about that. The following year, I wrote a second mystery, which had starred reviews from Kirkus and Library Journal. And I felt that I was doing well at that, but I also felt that my heart wasn't in it. So I took a little time off to think about it. And I applied to and got into the Yale Writers Workshop. And while I was there, I learned so much about writing. I learned so much about myself as a writer. And I thought, when you write, you have to write what you really love, not just, just something. So I sat down and I pulled all my favorite books off the shelves, and every single one was a historical novel. And I thought, it's been staring me in the face this whole time. That's what I'm supposed to be writing. That's what I read for fiction and nonfiction. That's what I'm interested in. Historical World War II books, and just all throughout history. So I found a whole new life and writing historical books. I'm so excited that I found my place in this world.
Well,
I majored in history, so it was a passion for me from the time that I was a child, and that's all I wanted to go to college to learn about was history. For me, it's a little hard to explain, but it would be well understood by the company I'm in that history just feels sacred. It feels like a sacred privilege to step into lives when I wasn't actually there, and somehow have this invitation to this time and this place and this event, and suddenly get to be a part of everything that has ever happened in the world. And when people tell me that they're not interested in history, I'm like, then you're not interested in anything, because history is everything. It's everything we've ever thought and felt and invented and done. And I just think history is a sacred place.
I have to agree with you, Regina. History is amazing, and we need to know it. And there's so many lessons to be learned. I mean, sometimes we fail and we fail and we fail, and things are so hard. When if we look at the lessons from history, what history teaches us, we can probably avoid so many pitfalls. And it's just so important for everybody to know their history. But personally speaking, I like history, but I will admit it wasn't ever really my favorite subject. And that's because it was, for me, sort of like you again, Regina, with the word problems. I liked the stories. I liked all the things that happened. But nonfiction history is, or can be, a little bit dry, because it relies, of course, on everything that's documented. And the most interesting things to me were the conversations the feelings, the emotions, some of the action, just to imagine to being there in these places, whether it's Roman chariots or a world war, just to actually be there. And that's why I fell in love with historical fiction at a fairly young age. I remember reading Herman Wouk's Winds of War when I was, still my young teens. And it was like magical. That was really the first historical novel I had read. And it was like, wow, history can be fun. There can be people and things and dialogue and emotions and love and romance and all those things. So that's what hooked me, and why also I love to write it. I love to put myself into those periods of history and imagine what it would be like, and research, what did they eat then? What was their vocabulary? What was what was the going on of the time? What were the things that people worried about? How did it really feel to live then? And that's what I love about historical fiction, and what I try to commit to when I write it.
Awesome.
I think I feel a lot the same as you, Tracey, like just to journey backward and imagine yourself in the shoes of people who lived in times that were exciting or
Did her screen freeze? Is that happening for everyone else?
I think so.
Yeah, I suddenly couldn't hear her any longer.
She'll probably reconnect in a minute.
Wait, does anyone
you
else
know,
have a question? Well, we can wait.
places where big change happened. Connection is off. Make sure the boys aren't on it.
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Back, okay.
Now we can.
Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm back. Sorry, I don't know what happened.
No worries.
Anyways, I don't know how much you heard, but I agree very much with Tracey about the excitement of going back and imagining yourself in someone else's life in the past. I've always been drawn to that. And it's just always where my creativity has happened. In junior high and science class, instead of paying attention, I was writing a comic book in my notebook about orphans living in the city of Pompeii, or it's just where my imagination goes. Although, like, I would not want to be living for real in the past. Like, I really like antibiotics. I can't function without my smartphone.
Right.
Who else has a question?
I have a question.
Excellent.
I'm curious about, and sort of specifically for Jema and Regina, but also for everybody, how you choose the topics for your books, and are they connected in some way? So, for example, for Regina and Jema, they wrote The Girl in His Shadow and Now the Surgeon's Daughter. So are those related stories, related only in your mind, or is it that's because that's the sort of field you feel most comfortable in? But just generally, how do you choose the stories you want to tell?
So The Surgeon's Daughter is the sequel to The Girl in His Shadow. So it's just a continuation. And for me, the stories I want to tell, it just comes from reading historical nonfiction. And when something grabs me and will not let go, when I cannot stop reading about it, then my first thought is, I want everyone to know this. I want everyone to know this story. So
I was inspired by people, and there's so many of them in history who are a little bit of outliers that, in spite of their circumstances, they were able to achieve pretty amazing things. And so I'm always drawn to that. And Regina and I do share an obsession with the history of scientific medicine. So that also comes into play.
Well, I have written a lot about the Second World War and the Holocaust. My father was in the service during the war. He wasn't in Europe. He was actually stateside. But the Second World War was something that I sort of grew up with. It was just part of the culture, the television shows, the movies, it was just there. And so it was, I felt pretty, closer to it than I might have felt about ancient Rome or Britain in the 11th century, although, I did attempt to write about all those things, but I really sort of settled into this. The first book, Cities of Women, was about what took place in Berlin at the height of the war, about women who were trying to save people from the Gestapo. The second book, Annalise, was about Anne Frank. It was sort of a speculative or alternative fiction. If she had survived, what would have happened? And then The Shadows of Berlin is about a Holocaust survivor in New York in the 50s who has to finally try to come to terms with what happened during the war while she was growing up in Berlin. I think for me, I've always been fascinated by grief, honestly, and how we deal with grief or guilt and how we try to redeem ourselves. And I've always felt that the Second World War and the aftermath gave me quite a canvas to paint on.
Wow.
I guess I
Anyone
should
else?
answer my own question. I became fascinated with stories, especially women's stories, because I feel that still, that they're not as represented as the men's stories in history. And so I started just really being fascinated by the women's story of big events or even small events. But I became fascinated with the women that we've actually never heard about. And there are wonderful stories about women who are quite famous or infamous, but I sort of wanted to find the ones that weren't so famous. So for example, The War Nurse is a story of Julia Stimson, who, I'd actually never heard of, and I was a nurse. And she was a nurse that was recruited from her nice, comfy position as director of nursing to take a group of nurses over to the front before we had soldiers there during World War I. So, that's the kind of story that fascinates me. And like I think it was Regina said that. That I can't stop thinking about the story of Emily Roebling and building the Brooklyn Bridge. And I grew up, basically almost in the shadow of it, and didn't know this amazing story about this amazing woman who did these things. And, we don't know because a lot of that history is actually hidden. And it makes it even sometimes a little bit more challenging to research, because a lot of what they did just simply wasn't written down. They didn't want credit or blame, or what they did was sometimes illegal. So it's a real challenge to find those stories and bring them to light. That's what I love to do.
Thank you, Tracey. That was really an interesting question. Who else has a question that they'd like to share with the group?
I have a question. And by the way, Tracey, you just answered one of the questions I had for you, which is, how did you find out about Julia Stimson? It was really interesting. So Jema and Regina, your story of meeting and writing together sounds really interesting. I've heard just a little bit of it, just enough to think it's almost like a Nora Ephron meet cute story. And it reminds me so much, I'm sure you're too young to know this movie, but there's a movie from the 80s called American Dreamer about a woman who wants to go to Paris and be a writer. And so she enters a writing contest, and that made me think of you.
Good.
So would one of you like to tell how you started writing together?
You want to take that one, Regina?
Sure. So Jema and I both wrote independently for years before we started writing together. And what happened is we had both entered our novels into what was then called the Amazon Breakthrough Novel of the Year Award. And they would let just amateur writers submit a novel, and they would get about 10,000 entries a year. And Jema and I ended up in the top 50. And so we were in the final rounds where your entire novel was put online and people could read it and judge it. It was like American Idol meets books kind of a thing. And that was 10 years ago. So the way that we met is I got an email one day, and it was from a girl named Jema in Canada that I didn't know. And she said, I read your book and it's beautiful, and I'm really happy for you because I think you're going to win. And I looked at it, and here she was, another finalist in the same contest, and she doesn't know me, she's not beholding, and she just had such this generous, kind thing to say to me. So I went and I read her novel because it was available, and I went, oh shucks, I'm not going to win because her book is beautiful. So but what happened, more important than any book contest or outcomes, is that we started to become friends. And then we started to say, do you mind looking at my current work and giving me your opinion? And we became each other's editors for years. I wouldn't show my work to anyone but Jema, and I trusted her talent and I trusted her skill. And so we started taking vacations to see each other. We started taking our families across national borders to see each other. And it was just the natural progression that she was in town for a book conference one year. And I said, we really should write a story together. I think there's a story that takes two people to tell it to its fullest extent. And that's how we started. 10 years ago. I just think it was meant to be.
Gina had suggested that we write this book, and I think we both just trusted each other and enjoyed working together so much that when she said that, I was like, okay, sure, but not in first person. And she said, all right. So we started.
Wow.
I had only written in first person to that point. So I had written about 4 novels in first person, and Jema said no. And I said, okay, this will be an adventure.
Have you adjusted?
Yeah. It wasn't as hard of an adjustment as I thought. I think it's harder to go to first person if you're not used to it than the other way. But maybe that's just because I have a natural propensity to write in first person. I don't know. But no, it wasn't a hard adjustment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Julia, for that question. That was a really touching story. I'm really glad you guys met, and you wouldn't have these books without that experience. So thank you. Regina, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
I do. So all of our readers and the readers that pick up our books, they get very invested into the characters, and they are rooting for the characters that we are putting down on the page. So Julia, you made me think of this question because I read your book, For Those That Are Lost, and I wanted to ask, how do you as authors feel when you end a book without your characters feeling resolved or satisfied? When you cannot give your readers that happy ending that they are flipping the pages trying to get to. How do you feel about that as an author?
Challenging, isn't it, to write the end of a book? And although you sit down with an outline and I think I know where this book is going, sometimes it takes you in different directions than you think you're going to go. I always find that to be true. And so in this book in particular, usually when I get about halfway through, I write the last chapter because I know I'm solid. I know what's going to happen. With this book, it took a little bit longer because the characters were still talking to me. So I wanted a ending that was realistic to the story, but I wanted something, that was just going to, I hope, satisfy all the readers who were rooting for different characters in my story. My book's actually about 2 women on both sides of the equation. One who is trapped on Guernsey. Her children have been shipped off with 5,000 other children. And the other is in England, and she steals a child and takes it and goes. And so a family is separated. And so it's a story of, will they find their way back together again? So that's very challenging.
And for me, I don't know. I tend not to know exactly where I'm going when I'm writing. I have a premise and I start from there, and I have an idea about where I might end up for a climax, but I never know exactly what's going to happen until I get there. Most of my characters have some gray in them, not just black or white. So the endings tend to be sometimes emotionally ambivalent. You know, I try to give hope. I think that's the most important thing that a book can give. And so I try to give the reader that emotion, that even if there is no quote unquote happy ending.
I love
I think
that.
that's a challenge with history, is, you know, sometimes to be true to the past, it's not a happy ending.
Right.
Yeah, I like David. I like your word of ambivalence, because I'm rather torn with this issue myself, because not so much in sort of the main story of my stories, but I always have a bit of a romance in there. You know, I don't write romances, but in my mind, you know, a character isn't complete with a little romance in their life, a relationship. So my quandary is how to end it if it is a historical relationship, and you know you don't want to change that, but rather where do you cut it off? How much do you leave your reader audience hanging? And you know, with my first novel, it was pretty clear where they were going to go, and there was some question of, you know, they did break up for a while, but would they get back again? And I think it was where I wanted to end it with them had to end with the climax of the book, and it was clear where it was going to end, and that's where the relationship ended, because that's when the bridge was done, and that was it. But with my second novel, my character historically went on and did amazing things after the war, and this relationship she was in went on for some time after the war, but it was a question of where do I want to end the story, because that's when that relationship is going to have to end. And I decided that the story ended when she left her core group of nurses, when she left Rouen, France, and then went on to administrative job in Paris. Even though her love followed her off to Paris, I didn't want to continue on with that relationship, because I had found the bookends of my story. So sometimes I do hear from readers who say, but what happened? Did they wind up together? Did they not? You left me hanging here. So I'm thinking maybe I have to write a bit of a follow-on, although I think the reality of it is a bit disappointing, which I think is another reason why, you know, I didn't want it in the book, because they sort of drifted away. So, oops, a spoiler for those who haven't read it.
Jema, do you have a question for the group that you'd like to ask?
Yeah. So
Did her screen freeze?
Yeah.
Oh no. Jema, I think your screen froze.
I mean, we've kind of
Let's give her a couple seconds. I have faith.
Her internet has to reach us all the way from Canada.
Yeah.
Right.
touched on it a bit. Oh,
Oh,
back?
Are you back, Jema?
Am I back? Can you hear me? Oh, I'll type my question.
thank you. Let's get out. Sorry about that. I wish I could control it or help. Let's see. So Jema is going to type her question into the chat box really quick, and I'll go ahead and read it. Let's see what she's got. All right, so her question is to the group, are you put is art, are you put inner or a take outer when you are building a historical setting? Did you guys get that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you add or take away as you are editing? There we go.
Take away for sure. I feel like, I just have to kind of edit it down a little bit because there's so much you want to say and you want to build that sense of place and time in your novel. So I'm trying to pack it all in. And then I think for the clarity of the story, I need to take out a little bit.
Mhm.
Wow, I'm exactly the opposite. I like to get to the structure of the scene and who's in it, and the goal of the scene, and what the characters' individual goals are, and what is the beginning and what is the end. And then later on, usually after I've gone down a rabbit hole of research, I add in sensory details and setting details and that kind of thing to make it come alive. But to me, that if I don't do the nuts and bolts of it first, I'll forget something important.
I'd have to say both, because I find that it's necessary to take away to give the right things the right weight and importance. But there's also a honing of the things that are left behind, and there's a changing and a refining of them. So I find that I take more away, but what's left behind becomes critically important, that the words be right and that the sound of the words linking together be right. And so I feel like I take more away, but what stays gets changed. It's kind of put it in, take it out.
Yeah, writing historical fiction, I think we all have to be careful of history lessons
Mm-hmm.
when we're writing.
That's right.
Saying too much to describe the scene, and so I will sort of err on the side of getting more information in the beginning, but then I'll go back and try to pare it down so that the action carries it. And of course, that's, for me at any rate, that's the magic trick to get the scene and the dialogue to actually carry the information rather than the description. But sometimes I use traveling scenes. There was a when in City of Women, when Siegfried's on a bus and she's going to work, but around her is war-torn Berlin, and so I have a moment that I can build the environment without losing the reader's interest. But it's a delicate balancing act.
Mm-hmm.
And with the Anne Frank book, Annalise, I realized I had to tell the story again because everybody knows who Anne Frank was, but not everybody quite remembers what the circumstances were. And so trying to do that without explaining too much was probably one of the biggest mountains I had to climb with that book.
Explaining is the bane of our existence, isn't it? To me, that's like first draft stuff that, I've got to tell the readers what happened. And then later on, we've got to add the magic, like you say, David, have it come out in a wonderful way out of the mouths of our characters or through the setting or however. That truly is the magic and something that, it's hard to do, really. It's a challenge. I think it will always be a challenge, and I guess that's a good thing. Keeps it interesting.
Jama, that question was awesome. Thank you for sharing that. What an
I'm
interesting
glad you
answer
got
for
it
everyone.
finally.
Yes, I know. I was like, am I saying it wrong? So I'm so sorry for that.
Sorry about my connection.
No worries, no worries.
I told my kids that they're allowed to game, but what's happening?
Yeah, thank you. So now we're going to go into the Q&A portion. I just want to thank our panelists first for those awesome questions. They were so insightful, and I think everyone learned so much. We do want to save time though for, all of our guests that are here, all the participants, to be able to have the opportunity to ask a question if they want. And so we do have an A box open, and we actually have a lot of questions, and I want to jump into those to make sure that they are answered. And I'm going to go in order of, when they were submitted. So the first question we have is for Tracey, and it's from Mary Barker, and she's asking, did the nuns encourage your writing?
Thank you, Mary. They did when they weren't swatting my hand with a metal ruler for talking too much. So that's, encouragement with the stick. But I do remember being asked to come up in front of the class and read my story after everybody had written something and turned it in. And that was kind of like, wow, this is cool, little nerve wracking, but it was sort of my first experience with public speaking as well. And I have to say, I'm much more addicted to the writing part of it than the public speaking part of it. Maybe that's why one of my characters fusses with that very much. But yes, nuns and nearly all my teachers throughout school were very encouraging for writing. And that's something that I think that maybe we need to emphasize more in education, that the kids write, because texting with their thumbs and stuff is not writing, and so much of what they do is taking away from expressing themselves through their written word, and it's just so important.
Thank you, Tracey, and I hope that answers your question, Mary. Up next we have Debbie, and she's asking, it's a question for Julia, and she asks, do you have a website? We were trying to draft your page and we wanted to know just a little bit more about you. If you don't have a website, can you give us an interesting fact about you that we wouldn't know?
I have an Instagram account and I have Twitter. I don't have a website right now. Let's see, an interesting fact about me is that I'm married to Will Thomas, who is best-selling novelist of 13 Victorian crime novels. And I've edited all of his books through these years. So he started, I think his first one was written in 2004. And while he was writing his books, I started writing my books, although I did not have immediate big success the way he did. So for me, it was more of a process, more of a learning curve. I learned so much through editing his work and through working with him, and just finding out how the publishing world works. I really knew so much about it by the time I finally did publish a novel that there were basically no surprises left. So, but it's been really fun. We call it our little cottage industry here, being writers. You can find me on Twitter and, like I said, on Instagram. And
Perfect.
There's a Facebook page too. So
thank you, Julia. The next question we have is from Debbie, and she's asking, this is for Jema and Regina. When you guys were talking about, the experience that you guys met and how you met, I think if I remember correctly, it was Regina. She said it takes two people to write a certain story and to write it to its full extent. Debbie wants to know, what exactly do you mean by that? You can expand on that.
Well, what I meant by that when I said it to Jema had written several Victorian historical fictions. So they had been set in the time and place that I really wanted to write about. So she had that world, she understood it. And I had been doing research for a couple of years at that point on medical history and the advancements of medicine, and really just the fascinating stories of the doctors and the surgeons and what was happening in their world and how they were meeting it. So to me, what I was saying is, I'm so overwhelmed trying to get these medical details correct. I don't know what kind of wagon they were driving. I don't know. I think it's going to take two brains to be able to put all of this together, because the information was overwhelming to me to recreate this world.
Thank you. Jema, would you like to add on to that at all?
We had become familiar enough with each other's work that we understood how to deploy each of our strengths to write one story. And it was exciting to think about how we could play off each other's strengths to make something that I think would be different and, kind of better than what we could come up with on our own.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome. This next question is for David, and it's from Stephanie. She's asking, in the shadows of Berlin, did you seek actual female friends' perspectives when you were writing from Rashka's perspective?
I've been asked questions similar to that for a while, because I usually write about women characters. I sometimes cast characters in my head, both male and female, and use sometimes film people, and I use that so I can hear their voice. And so in a way, yes, I do consult people when I'm writing, because I'm sort of playing them out in the story. But I tend not to show work to anyone really until it's in a full draft form. And the characters sort of come to me, they take on their own life, whether they're male or female. And I can't, it's hard to describe that when they reach that critical mass that I suddenly feel comfortable with them, and I can hear them and I can see them. And then the scenes start from there. I do have a woman for an agent, and for an editor, and for a publicist, and for a copy editor, and my wife is my first read. So in that respect, yes, I have lots of input from the women in my writing life.
Oh, thank you so much. And I just want to remind everyone in the audience that we are winding down in time. So if you do have, a question you really want to ask, this is your last call. But there's a question that Mary Barker has asked, and I also am very curious. So it's for everyone on the panel, and you can answer if you want. If not, don't worry about it. But what are each of you working on at the moment, if you don't mind sharing just a little bit?
I'll share.
Mm-hmm.
I am working on the story of the first female president of the United States, and yes, it is historical fiction. I'm writing a story about Edith and Woodrow Wilson. Edith, fairly famously a few years back, but I think most people have forgotten it now, basically took over the White House when her husband, Woodrow Wilson, had a severe stroke and was incapacitated for about the last year and a half of his second term. So having lots of fun researching that and writing it, very, very different from my different protagonists. And I hope everybody will enjoy it eventually. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Tracey. Anyone else want to share?
That's a great idea, by the way.
Mhm.
I don't know what I'm doing at the moment. I've started a few different things. I stare at the wall a lot. So nothing has, I've written 12 pages here, 16 pages of another story. And so at the moment, I'm still experimenting with waiting for that magic to happen to really know what I'm going to commit to next.
Yeah.
David, who's the actor for Aaron? I have to know.
Oh, Paul Reiser.
Oh,
Oh,
nice. I love
What
it.
about you? Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Mhm.
Regina and I are working on our third book together. It's set in the 20th century this time, around World War II. So we're excited about that.
Great. Great.
I'm working on a book set in 1955 on the campus of Harvard and Radcliffe. And it's about 4 young women coming into college. And if college is going to change them, if they're going to be women of the past, or if they're going to take on some of those modern ideas and become women of the future.
Sounds exciting.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you guys for sharing so much today. Just, we learned a lot and I took a bunch of notes. I hope everyone else did, writers out there in the audience or just fans of these authors. They're amazing. So we really enjoyed today's discussion. And one last reminder, you can still purchase these authors' books at our website at adventuresbythebook.com. I highly recommend it. These authors are amazing. So please support them by purchasing their books. And we also want to thank all of our adventurers for coming out and supporting these authors during, we came through the pandemic and we're still doing these virtual events because it really matters to get together and to hear these stories. I think it really matters. And we look forward to a lot more adventures coming up. So keep your eyes peeled for the e-blast coming out. If you are in or near San Diego, join us for our next live and in-person event on May 26th with world-renowned swimmer Lynn Cox for her new book, Al, the Water Rescue Dog. And our next virtual event is on May 14th, and it will feature New York Times bestselling author Sarah McCoy in conversation with bestselling author Kate Quinn as they discuss Sarah McCoy's much anticipated new novel, Mustique Island. So thank you, everyone. Let's give our authors a round of applause. And until next time, what will your next adventure by the book be? Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amber. Can someone do just one more screenshot? I never know how to do it and I mess it up.
Yeah, I think Susan can do one. Let's see. Okay, on 3, we'll smile. Ready?
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I hope she got it.
it.
Have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so
It was
much.
great.
So
Great
nice to all
conversation.
speak
Good
with
to
you.
meet you.
Nice to